In today's notes, we're going to be learning about the characteristics of life. So, with this, you should be taking your notes on the note taking sheet that you've been provided. Take all of the bold definitions on the left side of the sheet and write down any examples or details on the right side of the sheets of anything that you might be hearing during this lecture. At any time, please stop and record things that are off of the screen. However, there will also be vocal things that are said that will also be useful to you when it comes to taking down some examples and details. To start off, let's start with the first characteristic of life. In the first characteristic of life, all living things are made up of cells. A cell is the smallest possible living unit that can carry out all of life's processes. So when we're thinking about the cell, it contains every little piece inside of it that can carry out life. Living things can either be unicellular or multicellular. So unicellular means that it's made up of only one cell, uni meaning one, multi meaning multiple, multicellular meaning that it's made up of multiple cells. So we're trying to think of like humans are more than one cell or not. And that's a good question for you to try to answer with that. Moving on to our second characteristic of life, all living things use energy. So the sun is the main source of the energy in the earth. All plants are going to take in the sun's energy and turn that into some type of food source for them, or food source for humans and other things that eat plants. And they're going to use that energy to create ATP or the energy source for themselves to continue functioning. So we will take that energy from the plants, the sun will take the energy from the sun, and then that kind of goes around in a circle. Because when humans die, they decompose, and then that becomes the new energy for the plants. So in order for something to be considered alive, a second characteristic of life must be true, meaning that they need energy in some way. Our third characteristic of life is talking about all living things responding to their environment. Now, this is a specific type of response. It means it can respond to either immediate or long-term changes in the environment. It's something known as homeostasis. This is often confused with evolution, meaning that as an environment change, maybe an organism will develop something new as a way to respond to that. And this isn't what we're talking about now. The best way to kind of think of an example for this are the following: of dogs panting when they're hot, pupils dilating or getting bigger when in low light levels. If you are seeing somebody in the dark and you shine a flashlight at their eye very quickly, you'll see that their eyes are very wide. Humans sweating when the body gets too hot is a means to try to cool their body down and get some of that heat away, as well as reflexes. So if I touch a hot stove, if I'm in the middle of a scary situation or somebody comes up on me, it's a fight or flight response. So either I would run away or fight in that current situation. So that's us reacting to what's going on with us in the environment. Characteristic 4 is that all living things reproduce. In order to be a living thing, they have to make either copies of themselves or they have to reproduce with another organism of their species to create new offspring. So this could be either through sexual reproduction, which is two organisms contributing genetic material to the offspring. So chromosomes coming from the male and the female mixing together to make a unique new person, or like a new human being with traits from both, or asexual. So one organism only contributing their genetic material to the offspring. The fifth characteristic is all living things grow and develop. So to grow means to get bigger, more cells, adding more cells to the body, adding more cells to the mass, a cell getting larger over time. And develop means to change into a more adult form, also known as maturing. So humans go through a couple different stages of that. We have infants, toddlers, adolescents, adults, and then senior citizens. And these all change over time, and they have distinct characteristics. Children not being able to really provide for themselves, toddlers and being able to provide a little bit for themselves by being able to ask, adolescents and adults being able to provide for themselves by having full conversations and moving. So they all have different stages. Our sixth characteristic here is that all living things adapt to fit their environment or evolve. This gets confused a lot with homeostasis, but it is very different. This means that organisms are adapting to changes in their environment or they risk becoming extinct. So if a climate is getting hotter over time, the species of organism might lose layers of fat that they have as a means to keep cooler over time. If a environment is changing colors, say, for example, bears might go from having more light color fur to darker color fur if the amount of snow cover or ground cover changes, and they can change color. So this happens over a long period of time. Homeostasis happens over a very shorter period of time, quick reactions, but evolution requires a big change over a larger period of time. So they seem very similar, but they are very different. So some of the adaptations in the organisms here that we can see would be in the upper left there, we have a snow fox with a white fur in a snowy environment. It does not have brown fur, and the meaning for that is so that they can blend in. So that's one example there for you. I encourage you to find some other examples of some different adaptations of the organisms that are on the screen. Particularly interesting is the adaptations found in the Venus flytrap, which is the green and pink picture in the middle of the bottom, and with the sharks in the lower left. Our final characteristic that we're going to talk about here of the 7 is the 7th characteristic of all living things have DNA. DNA is a specific molecule that provides instructions for making of another molecule called proteins. The best way to think about DNA is like an instruction booklet. But it's an instruction booklet for your entire body. So say if I gave you a whole bucket of Legos or building blocks of some sort, and there's just a bunch of random blocks. And I can give you an instruction booklet that you can look at the blocks and you can build an airplane, you can build a building, you can build a car. But depending on what the instructions tell you, you'll use those materials to build that instruction. The instructions are the DNA. And the DNA carries the genetic material from parent to offspring, which is also known as heredity. So if you have brown eyes, chances are good that your parents also had brown eyes, or at least carried the information to make brown eyes. So that's really important when it comes to developing new traits in organisms in the future. So before I continue on to the living, dead, and non-living objects, I do want to point something out. When you go and you look up the characteristics of life, you might find lists that have a different number. So I'm going to quickly go back. You might find lists that have a different number. That's okay. Scientists will argue about how many characteristics of life need to exist. The current ones that I've seen, 7 characteristics seems to be the big number and seems to be the one that's used the most. So please try to refer back to this video and with these characteristics. However, the other characteristics of life numbers that you find are not wrong. They just might be adding different things or removing different things from this list. But I would try to refer back to this if you can. To end everything off here, finally, and at the bottom of your notes there, you'll see 3 lines for this, is the difference between living, dead, and non-living objects, which sounds kind of obvious, but it isn't in some regards. So living things must have all 7 characteristics of life to be considered living. If we're talking about a living thing and the living thing does not reproduce, it's not a living thing. It is something that has some characteristics of a living thing, but not alive. So a dead organism once had all 7 characteristics of a living thing, but does now not have 7 characteristics of living things. If I take a tree and I cut the tree down and I make a house out of it, the house is not alive because it was made of a tree. It once was, but it is now a dead organism that I use to build the house. And finally, non-living things may have some characteristics of living things, but do not have all 7 of them. And one of those that I kind of want you to look at yourself is a virus. Viruses are often considered living things, but they're not because they don't contain a couple of things that are required to be a living thing. And that's the end of the notes. Please go back and look through any of the notes here, ask questions in class or respond to this on Google Classroom. And yeah, please refer back to this at any point that you have anything that you need to study. Thank you.